Breaking news! President Trump is going to impose some tariffs on Canada, and they are slated to take effect as early as February 1st, 2025. Listen to this report from Global News where Trump announced his plans.
So we'll be announcing the tariffs on Canada and Mexico for a number of reasons. Number one is the people that have poured into our country so horribly and so much. Number two are the drugs, fentanyl, and everything else that have come into the country. And number three are the massive subsidies that we're giving to Canada and to Mexico in the form of deficits. And I'll be putting the tariff of 25% on Canada and separately 25% on Mexico. And we will really have to do that because we have very big deficits with those countries. Those tariffs may or may not rise with time.
Will oil be part of that, though? Because we get oil from Canada.
Oil is going to have nothing to do with it as far as I'm concerned. Oil has nothing to do with it.
Tariffs on Canada and Mexico, 25%. That's coming on Saturday?
It's coming on the 1st, Saturday.
But no oil tariff, no oil tariffs.
No, I don't. Well, I didn't say that. You said that. No.
Well, I don't want to misinterpret.
No, we may or may not. We're going to make that determination probably tonight on oil. Yeah, because they send us oil. We'll see. It depends on what the price is. If the oil is properly priced, if they treat us properly, which they don't. Look, Mexico and Canada have never been good to us on trade. They've treated us very unfairly on trade. And we will be able to make that up very quickly because we don't need the products that they have. We have all the oil you need.
So how is this going to affect Canada? Here is a report from CBC News informing us of the strategies the Bank of Canada has in place to negate any negative effects of the trade wars.
The Bank of Canada just made its first interest rate decision since a trade war with the US became a real possibility. They cut their overnight interest rate a 1/4 percentage point, which is great news for anyone borrowing money. But they also acknowledged that a storm may be coming.
We will tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens.
Trump's promised tariffs have the potential to throw Canada's economy into a tailspin.
Tariff!
In the case of a protracted, significant trade conflict, it would badly hurt economic activity in Canada.
There is still a ton of uncertainty here about how all of this will play out, but the Bank of Canada did lay out a worst-case scenario and what it might mean. Let's go through it. So what is the most severe scenario? Well, it's where Donald Trump goes full steam ahead and implements 25% tariffs across the board, as he said he'll do, and where Canada implements sweeping retaliatory tariffs in response, as they've suggested they might do. The first thing the Bank of Canada predicts is that this would cause a significant decline in the volume of exports from Canada to the US, which makes sense because tariffs are just taxes paid for by the businesses doing the buying. So if American companies suddenly have to pay more for the same Canadian stuff because there's a 25% tax on everything Canadian, they might just decide to buy less stuff to avoid the tariffs altogether.
What tariffs should do is decrease anybody's willingness to buy the more expensive product and make them come up with ways of finding something cheaper, something more efficient, something closer to home.
And if demand starts decreasing for Canadian exports, the value of those exports could drop too.
Usually when there's less demand for a product, the price of that product falls as well. And the Bank of Canada is saying that would happen here.
Whether you're exporting to the US or not is almost irrelevant. It's just merely the fact that you are producing more than what your domestic economy needs.
So you take those things together, lower demand for Canadian goods and lower prices for those goods. That's bad news for Canadian business. And you know what Canada exports an awful lot of? Oil.
If you take $10 off the price of oil, that's a couple $1 billion less of royalty revenue that the province is bringing in.
And here you start to see how every downside outcome causes another downside outcome, like dominoes falling one by one. Because the Bank of Canada writes that eventually that kind of hit to business would cause Canadian exporters to lower production and lay off workers. They've got to scale down if they're not making the same kind of money, right? There's no exact figure for how many jobs they think could be lost, but
we would probably expect the unemployment rate rises about a percentage point or so.
You're easily talking into the hundreds of thousands of jobs.
Doug Ford says as many as 500,000 jobs in Ontario alone. Just about everybody involved in this has a slightly different figure, but the short answer is an enormous number of Canadian jobs are exposed to this, are at risk as a result of it.
And it's not just job losses, because when you think about how Canada might retaliate, putting countervailing tariffs, taxes on American imports to Canada, I mean, just think of what American products you rely on any given day.
Things like fresh fruit and vegetables, which obviously it's winter in Canada. We import a lot of those from the United States.
There's also cars, machinery, drugs, chemicals, electronics. Those might all become more expensive too. For the same reason that US tariffs make things more expensive in the US. Canadian companies importing American things will have to pay Canadian tariffs to the Canadian government. And in many cases, some or all of those additional costs may eventually be passed on to Canadian consumers.
The reality is that the more of their stuff that we tariff, whether as part of the supply chain or whether as part of just being consumers that we consume the products directly, we're going to start paying more money.
So, lost jobs, less purchasing power, which brings us to the Bank of Canada's next prediction. According to the Bank of Canada, all of these factors together could cause Canada's GDP to fall pretty significantly. They do acknowledge in their analysis that the government could mitigate this by taking some of that tariff money that they start charging and pumping it back into the economy, either to businesses or consumers themselves. But even still,
This would have a very material effect, would have a very severe effect on economic activity.
so how severe are we talking? Well, here's where we begin to understand how impossibly complex this question becomes. Because instead of giving just one definitive prediction in this case, the bank maps out multiple ways in which this one scenario could play out, depending on how quickly businesses pass on their extra costs to us, the consumers, and how everybody responds to this general idea of certain things becoming more expensive. But best case, they predict next year, Canada's GDP would be 2.2% lower than what it would have been otherwise. Worst case, 3% lower. To which maybe you're like, 3%, that's not so bad. Except it's bad enough to throw the country into a recession.
The economy is growing about 1.8% right now. In their assumption, if we get a 2.5 percentage point hit to growth, that's pretty consistent with normal recession in Canada.
I think the interesting thing here is it's effectively a permanent recession. There's no real way out of that drop in GDP. And I think that's where it starts to get really hard to really measure and get your head around what that actually feels like, what it looks like.
So here's one more question. If this worst case scenario does play out and this brand of tariff war forces Canada into a recession with no clear endpoint, how exactly might the bank respond? We're talking about interest rates, right? That's the lever the Bank of Canada has. But on this, the one real thing we turned to them for guidance on, they were actually pretty cryptic, opting not to give any real indication as to what it might do next.
There's a lot of uncertainty out there, and it just didn't seem very useful to provide guidance. And even when we do know more, we're going to have to do some more work to figure out exactly how that's going to play out through the.
What is the government planning to do? According to a report by CTV News, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stated that Canada has a purposeful, forceful, but reasonable immediate response to Trump's tariffs. Please listen to the Prime Minister's response.
Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Plaisir de vous voir ici. C'est bien. Ah, there we go. Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, everyone. Plaisir de vous voir ici pour cette rencontre du Conseil sur les relations Canada-États-Unis. Content de voir tant de personnes ici avec nous. Je veux aussi souligner nos amis qui sont à travers le pays. I want to highlight a new member of the council, Peter Tertsakian. Great to see you again, Peter. Glad you could join us. I'm glad you've all joined me today. Because we're at a critical moment. As President Trump stated yesterday, he is still committed to placing tariffs on Canada starting as early as tomorrow, possibly. Now, we don't know precisely what that could look like, but I do know two things. First, if the president does choose to implement any tariffs against Canada, we're ready with a response. A purposeful, forceful, but reasonable, immediate response. It's not what we want, but if he moves forward, we will also act. Deuxièmement, on est prêt pour tous les scénarios possibles. We're ready for whatever scenario comes forward. Et ça, notamment, c'est grâce à vous tous. Votre travail est d'une valeur inestimable et son impact se fait déjà ressentir. The way you have all pulled together regions of the country, industries, thoughtful business leaders and thought leaders to unite as part of Team Canada, to be ready and flexible, whatever comes, is not just the right thing to do, it's also deeply reassuring. Reassuring to Canadians, reassuring to business owners, to workers, and to people around the world who look to Canada as a key partner. You've been speaking out, stressing that tariffs against Canada would have disastrous consequences for the United States, putting American jobs at risk, raising prices on Americans, and undermining our collective security. Votre point de vue et vos conseils ont été d'une valeur inestimable pour guider notre réponse à la menace d'imposition de droits de douane. Vous avez aidé à rassurer les Canadiens pendant une période difficile et pleine d'incertitudes. You've shown what it means to be part of Team Canada, fighting for this country we all love so much. At the same time, our government has responded to what the president is focused on and what is motivating him to consider applying tariffs as early as tomorrow, the flow of fentanyl and illegal crossings into the United States. Now, let me reiterate it. Our border is safe and secure, and less than 1% of fentanyl and illegal crossings into the United States come from Canada. We're committed to keeping it that way by addressing current challenges and strengthening our capacity. That's why we're implementing the $1.3 billion border plan we announced late last year. In fact, the first patrol helicopters began monitoring the border earlier this week, and new canine teams along with imaging tools are being deployed to detect and stop the flow of fentanyl. Meanwhile, our previously implemented border measures are already showing results too. We've ended the practice of flagpoling, when temporary residents travel to the United States only to immediately return to Canada to access immigration services, a decision that's saving Canadian and American border officials time and resources. And we're bringing in heightened security for visa applications, which has resulted in an 89% drop in illegal crossings by foreign citizens to the United States in the second half of last year. This is real progress. As the President's Commerce Secretary nominee acknowledged the other day, it demonstrates that we are committed to the Canada-U.S. relationship, committed to upholding the safety and security of our shared border. And while we will continue to explain that Canada is the trading partner the United States needs for its long-term prosperity and global security, Canada has steel and aluminum, critical minerals, clean and affordable energy, stable democratic institutions, shared values, and the best workers in the world. Right now, we're showing the new American administration that they have a strong partner in Canada when it comes to upholding border security, all while simultaneously underscoring that we won't back down, that if tariffs are implemented against Canada, we will respond.
What do you think of all these? Will tensions rise between the two countries? How will this impact U.S.-Canada relations? Will Canada's retaliation be effective enough? Drop your comments. Subscribe for more updates.